Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to unpack John Carreyrou's absolute masterpiece of investigative journalism, Bad Blood. Today, we're taking a close look at the explosive rise and the spectacular fall of Theranos. It's honestly one of the most fascinating and downright cautionary tales in modern business history. We're going to break down exactly how one Silicon Valley startup managed to pull the wool over the eyes of some of the most powerful people on the planet.
So let's just dive right in, and we have to start with this staggering number, $9 billion. That was the peak valuation of a blood testing startup that promised it was going to completely change the world. I mean, $9 billion is an almost unimaginable sum of money, especially for a company that, as we'll find out, was built entirely on a foundation of sand and completely broken promises. At the time, the media hype was just deafening. You had magazines boldly declaring things like, "This CEO is out for blood." The founder, Elizabeth Holmes, was suddenly popping up on magazine covers absolutely everywhere, and people were literally comparing her to tech titans like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. The press just couldn't get enough of her whole aesthetic, the signature black turtlenecks, and her incredibly bold claims about revolutionizing healthcare. But as detailed in the meticulously reported source material we're exploring today, this multi-billion-dollar valuation was a complete mirage. It was an unprecedented corporate illusion. What was being presented to the public, and frankly even to the investors, was a carefully constructed facade, and it masked a really shocking reality going on behind closed laboratory doors.
Okay, here's our quick roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to hit the Silicon Valley darling, a culture of deception, the $9 billion illusion, the investigation begins, and finally, when tech meets healthcare.
Part 1. The Silicon Valley darling, building the hype.
To pull this off, Elizabeth Holmes surrounded herself with an incredibly distinguished, very high-profile cast of older men. We're talking heavy hitters, military and political leaders like George Shultz, James Mattis, and Henry Kissinger. These guys vouched for her integrity, which gave Theranos a massive aura of credibility. But here is the fatal flaw in that setup. They fundamentally lacked the medical and scientific expertise needed to actually vet her technological claims. They had power, for sure, but they definitely weren't scientists.
And the revolutionary technology those investors thought they were funding, it was vastly different from what was secretly being used. The promise sounded like magic. Just one single drop of blood from a tiny finger prick could run hundreds of tests. But the reality? They were totally faking their live demonstrations. Take 2006, for example. Holmes flew to Switzerland to show off the system to the pharmaceutical giant Novartis. The results they saw were entirely fabricated. Behind the scenes, Theranos was quietly relying on standard, conventional blood testing machines manufactured by other companies. It was all smoke and mirrors.
Part 2. A culture of deception. The internal reality.
Internally, any early red flags were aggressively shut down. When Theranos' chief financial officer, Henry Moseley, actually found out about that fake Switzerland demo, he realized they were actively fooling their investors. So he brings his concerns directly to Elizabeth Holmes. And what happens? Her usually cheerful demeanor just vanishes into this icy stare. She tells him he's not a team player and fires him, literally on the spot. If you question the narrative at Theranos, you were gone.
To keep the illusion from shattering, the company bred an environment of extreme paranoia. The clinical lab windows were heavily tinted to block anyone from seeing inside. They had fingerprint scanners and dome surveillance cameras tracking everyone's movements. They even banned employees from using Google Chrome because they were terrified Google was somehow spying on their research. Plus, security was run by a former military bodyguard who literally wore a holstered gun around the office. Management justified this wildly toxic culture as protecting trade secrets. But let's be real, it was just a mechanism to keep employees siloed so no one would realize the technology was a total bust.
Part 3. The $9 billion illusion, cash and control.
Now, check this out. By late 2013, Holmes forced through a resolution that handed her 99.7% of the company's voting rights. From that single moment on, her prestigious board of directors couldn't even reach a quorum without her being in the room. George Shultz actually admitted later in a deposition that they basically never took any votes because it was totally pointless. Elizabeth made every single decision. That glittering all-star board, it was nothing more than a powerless placeholder used to lure in more investors.
Propelled by that high-profile board and some wildly optimistic, honestly downright false revenue projections, the company hit that unbelievable $9 billion valuation. And that skyrocketed Holmes' personal net worth to nearly $5 billion.
On paper, it made her the youngest, self-made female billionaire in Silicon Valley. But it was an entire empire built on a lie.
Part 4. The investigation begins, exposing the fraud.
But a house of cards like this eventually catches a breeze. John Carreyrou's investigation was methodical and, frankly, dangerous. It started with a simple tip from a pathologist who flagged federal proficiency testing violations. Carreyrou dug in, tracked down former employees to corroborate these massive lab failures, and he faced absolute hell for it. He endured severe legal threats and intense intimidation from Theranos' superstar lawyer David Boies, but he didn't back down, finally dropping his explosive front-page article in the Wall Street Journal in October 2015, revealing they were mostly just using standard off-the-shelf machines.
You know what's crazy? Even during these intense pushback meetings before the piece was published, Theranos' lawyers couldn't actually explain how their technology worked. They just kept hiding behind trade secrets. It got so absurd that one of the journal editors, Jay, finally just quipped, "It sounds like the Wizard of Oz," and he hit the nail on the head. The journalists realized there was literally nothing behind the curtain. The whole thing was just a grand performance.
Part 5. When Tech Meets Healthcare, the Human Cost.
Now, the most absolutely crucial takeaway from this whole explainer isn't about lost venture capital, right? It's about the very real, terrifying danger this fraud posed to everyday patients. As Elizabeth Holmes herself loved to point out, doctors base 70% of their medical treatment decisions on laboratory results. When your company pumps out flawed, inaccurate blood tests, it directly causes nightmare scenarios in the real world. A false positive could mean someone gets a totally unnecessary, highly invasive medical procedure. And a false negative? That could mean a fatal condition goes entirely undiagnosed. The classic Silicon Valley ethos is fake it till you make it, right? And okay, maybe that's somewhat acceptable if you're launching a buggy new software app or some social media platform. The worst harm there is usually just user frustration. But applying that exact same culture of extreme hype and overpromising to medical devices, you are fundamentally gambling with human lives. Trial and error on actual people is just not okay.
We've seen exactly how easily prestigious names, extreme corporate secrecy, and a charismatic founder can mask a deeply dangerous reality. Which leaves us with this vital final question to think about as we wrap things up. Have we finally learned to demand hard, scientific proof over charismatic hype? Or is accountability in the tech sector still just an illusion, and the next billion-dollar mirage is already under construction? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.